Though summer that year had lingered in the lowland and on the plains of Algaria, autumn was brief. The blizzards and squalls they had encountered in the mountains above Marigor and again among the peaks of Ulgo had hinted that winter would be early and severe, and there was already a chill to the nights as they rode day after day across the open grassland toward the eastern escarpment. Helgarath had recovered from his momentary fit of anger over Gerion's failure to deal with Relg's attack of guilt, but then, with inescapable logic, he had placed an enormous burden squarely on Gerion's shoulders. "For some reason he trusts you," the old man observed, "so I'm going to leave him entirely in your hands. I don't care what you have to do, but keep him from flying apart again." At first, Rel refused to respond to Gerion's efforts to draw him out, but after a while one of the waves of panic caused by the thought of the open sky above swept over the zealot, and he began to talk, haltingly at first, but then finally in a great rush. As Geryon had feared, Relg's favorite topic was sin. Geryon was amazed at the simple things that Relg considered sinful. Forgetting to pray before a meal, for example, was a major transgression. As the fanatic's gloomy catalogue of his faults expanded, Geryon began to perceive that most of his sins were sins of thought rather than of action. The one matter that kept cropping up again and again was the question of lustful thoughts about women. To Geryon's intense discomfort, Relg insisted on describing these lustful thoughts extensively. "Women are not the same as we are, of course," the zealot confided one afternoon as they rode together. "Their minds and hearts are not drawn to holiness the way ours are, and they set out deliberately to tempt us with their bodies and draw us into sin." "Why do you suppose that is?" Geryon asked carefully. "Their hearts are filled with lust," Relg declared adamantly. "They take particular delight in tempting the righteous. I tell you truly, Belgarian, you would not believe the subtlety of the creatures. I have seen the evidence of this wickedness in the soberest of matrons, the wives of some of my most devout followers. They're forever touching, brushing, as if by accident, and they take great pains to allow the sleeves of their robes to slip up brazenly to expose their rounded arms, and the hems of their garments always seem to be hitching up to display their ankles." "If it bothers you, don't look," Geryon suggested. Relg ignored that. "I have even considered banning them from my presence, but then I thought that it might be better if I kept my eyes on them so I could protect my followers from their wickedness. I thought for a time that I should forbid marriage among my followers, but some of the older ones told me that I might lose the young if I did that. I still think it might not be a bad idea." "Wouldn't that sort of eliminate your followers altogether?" Garen asked him. "I mean, if you kept it up long enough, no marriage, no children, you get my point." "That's the part I haven't worked out yet," Relg admitted. "And what about the child, the new Gorham? If two people are supposed to get married so they can have a child, that particular special child, and you persuade them not to, aren't you interfering with something that all wants to happen?" Relg drew in a sharp breath as if he had not considered that. Then he groaned. "You see, even when I'm trying my very hardest, I always seem to stumble straight into sin. I'm cursed, Belgarian, cursed! Why did Ul choose me to reveal the child when I am so corrupt?" Garion quickly changed the subject to head off that line of thought. For 9 days they crossed the endless sea of grass toward the eastern escarpment, and for 9 days the others, with a callousness that hurt Geryon to the quick, left him trapped in the company of the ranting zealot. He grew sulky, and frequently cast reproachful glances at them, but they ignored him. Near the eastern edge of the plain they crested a long hill, and stared for the first time at the immense wall of the eastern escarpment, a sheer basalt cliff rising fully a mile above the rubble at its base and stretching off into the distance in either direction. "Impossible!" Beric stated flatly. "We'll never be able to climb that." "We won't have to," Silk told him confidently. "I know a trail." "A secret trail, I suppose?" "Not exactly a secret," Silk replied. "I don't imagine too many people know about it, but it's right out in plain sight, if you know where to look. I had occasion to leave Mishrak Akthul in a hurry once, and I stumbled across it." "One gets the feeling that you've had occasion to leave just about every place in a hurry at one time or another." Silk shrugged. Knowing when it's time to run is one of the most important things people in my profession ever learn. Will the river ahead not prove a barrier? Mandaralin asked, looking at the sparkling surface of the Alder River lying between them and the grim black cliff. He was running his fingertips lightly over his side, testing for tender spots. Mandaralin, stop that, Aunt Paul told him. They'll never heal if you keep poking at them. Methinks, my lady, that they are nearly whole again, the knight replied. Only one still causes me any discomfort. Well, leave it alone. There's a ford a few miles upstream, Belgrath said in answer to the question. The river is down at this time of the year, so we won't have any difficulty crossing. He started out again, leading them down the gradual slope toward the Alder. They forded late that afternoon and pitched their tents on the far side. The next morning they moved out to the foot of the escarpment. The trail's just a few miles south, Silk told them, leading the way along the looming black cliff. Do we have to go up along the face of it? Garion asked apprehensively, craning his neck to look up the towering wall. Silk shook his head. The trail's a stream bed. It cuts down through the cliff. It's a little steep and narrow, but it'll get us safely to the top. Garion found that encouraging. The trail appeared to be little more than a crack in the stupendous cliff, and a trickle of water ran out of the opening to disappear into the jumble of rocky debris along the base of the escarpment. Are you sure it goes all the way to the top? Beric asked, eyeing the narrow chimney suspiciously. Trust me, Silk assured him. Not if I can help it. The trail was awful, steep and strewn with rock. At times it was so narrow that the pack horses had to be unloaded before they could make it through, and they had to be literally manhandled up over basalt boulders that had fractured into squares, almost like huge steps. The trickle of water running down the cut made everything slick and muddy. To make matters even worse, thin high clouds swept in from the west, and a bitterly cold draught spilled down the narrow cut from the arid plains of Mishrak Akthul lying high above. It took them 2 days, and by the time they reached the top, a mile or so back from the brink of the escarpment, they were all exhausted. I feel as if somebody's been beating me with a stick, Beric groaned, sinking to the ground in the brushy gully at the top of the cut. A very big, dirty stick. They all sat on the ground among the prickly thorn bushes in the gully, recovering from the dreadful climb. I'll have a look around, Silk said after a few moments. The small man had the body of an acrobat, supple, strong, and quick to restore itself. He crept up the rim of the gully, ducking low under the thorn bushes and worming his way the last few feet on his stomach to peer carefully over the top. After several minutes, he gave a low whistle, and they saw him motion sharply for them to join him. Beric groaned again and stood up. Dernick, Mandaralin, and Garion also got stiffly to their feet. See what he wants, Belgrath told them. I'm not ready to start moving around just yet. The four of them started up the slope through the loose gravel toward the spot where Silk lay peering out from under a thorn bush, crawling the last few feet as he had done. What's the trouble? Beric asked the little man as they came up beside him. Company, Silk replied shortly, pointing out over the rocky, arid plain, lying brown and dead under the flat gray sky. A cloud of yellow dust, whipped low to the ground by the stiff, chill wind, gave evidence of riders. A patrol? Dernick asked in a hushed voice. I don't think so, Silk answered. Thulls aren't comfortable on horses. They usually patrol on foot. Garion peered out across the arid waste. Is that somebody out in front of them? He asked, pointing at a tiny moving speck a half-mile or so in front of the riders. Ah, Silk said with a peculiar kind of sadness. What is it? Beric asked. Don't keep secrets, Silk. I'm not in the mood for it. They're Grollems, Silk explained. The one they're chasing is a Thull trying to escape being sacrificed. It happens rather frequently. Should Belgarath be warned? Mandaralin suggested. It's probably not necessary, Silk replied. The Grollems around here are mostly low-ranking. I doubt that any of them would have any skill at sorcery. I'll go tell him anyway, Dernick said. He slid back away from the edge of the gully, rose, and went back down to where the old man rested with Aunt Paul and Relg. As long as we stay out of sight, we'll probably be all right, Silk told them. It looks as if there are only 3 of them, and they're concentrating on the Thull. The running man had moved closer. He ran with his head down and his arms pumping at his sides. "What happens if he tries to hide here in the gully?" Beric asked. Silk shrugged. "The Groms will follow him." "We'd have to take steps at that point, wouldn't we?" Silk nodded with a wicked little smirk. "We could call him, I suppose," Beric suggested, loosening his sword in its sheath. The same thought had occurred to me. Dernick came back up the slope, his feet crunching in the gravel. "Wolf says to keep an eye on them," he reported, "but he says not to do anything unless they actually start into the gully." "What a shame," Silk sighed regretfully. The running Thull was clearly visible now. He was a thick-bodied man in a rough tunic belted at the waist. His hair was shaggy and mud-colored, and his face was contorted into an expression of brutish panic. He passed the place where they hid, perhaps 30 paces out on the flats, and Geryon could clearly hear his breath whistling in his throat as he pounded past. He was whimpering as he ran, an animal-like sound of absolute despair. "They almost never try to hide," Silk said in a soft voice tinged with pity. "All they do is run." He shook his head. "They'll overtake him soon," Mandaral observed. The pursuing Grollems wore black hooded robes and polished steel masks. "We'd better get down," Beric advised. They all ducked below the gully rim. A few moments later the 3 horses galloped by, their hooves thudding on the hard earth. "They'll catch him in a few more minutes," Geryon said. "He's running right for the edge. He'll be trapped." "I don't think so," Silk replied somberly. A moment later they heard a long despairing shriek fading horribly into the gulf below. "I more or less expected that," Silk said. Geryon's stomach wrenched at the thought of the dreadful height of the escarpment. "They're coming back," Beric warned. "Get down." The 3 Grollems rode back along the edge of the gully. One of them said something Geryon could not quite hear, and the other 2 laughed. "The world might be a brighter place with 3 less Grollems in it," Mandaral suggested in a grim whisper. "Attractive thought," Silk agreed, "but Belgarath would probably disapprove. I suppose it's better to let them go. We wouldn't want anybody looking for them." Beric looked longingly after the 3 Grollems, then sighed with deep regret. "Let's go back down," Silk said. They all turned and crawled back down in the brushy gully. Belgarath looked up as they returned. "Are they gone?" "They're riding off," Silk told him. "What was that cry?" Relg asked. 3 Golems chased a Thull off the edge of the escarpment," Silk replied. "Why?" "He'd been selected for a certain religious observance, and he didn't want to participate." "He refused?" Relg sounded shocked. "He deserved his fate, then." "I don't think you appreciate the nature of Grollem ceremonies, Relg," Silk said. "One must submit to the will of one's god," Relg insisted. "Religious obligations are absolute." Silk's eyes glittered as he looked at the Ulgo fanatic. "How much do you know about the Angarak religion, Relg?" he asked. "I concern myself only with the religion of Ulgo." "A man ought to know what he's talking about before he makes judgments." "Let it lie, Silk," Aunt Paul told him. "I don't think so, Pulchera, not this time. A few facts might be good for our devout friend here. He seems to lack perspective." Silk turned back to Relg. "The core of the Angarak religion is a ritual most men find repugnant. Thulls devote their entire lives to avoiding it. That's the central reality of Thullish life." "An abominable people!" Relg's denunciation was harsh. "No, Thulls are stupid, even brutish, but they're hardly abominable. You see, Relg, the ritual we're talking about involves human sacrifice." Relg pulled the veil from his eyes to stare incredulously at the rat-faced little man. "Each year 2,000 Thulls are sacrificed to Torak," Silk went on, his eyes boring into Relg's stunned face. The Grolums permit the substitution of slaves, so a Thull spends his whole life working in order to get enough money to buy a slave to take his place on the altar, if he's unlucky enough to be chosen. But slaves die sometimes, or they escape. If a Thull without a slave is chosen, he usually tries to run. Then the Grolums chase him. They've had a lot of practice, so they're very good at it. I've never heard of a Thull actually getting away. It's their duty to submit, Relg maintained stubbornly, though he seemed a bit less sure of himself. How are they sacrificed? Dernick asked in a subdued voice. The Thull's willingness to hurl himself off the escarpment had obviously shaken him. It's a simple procedure, Silk replied, watching Relg closely. 2 Grolums bend the Thull backward over the altar, and a third cuts his heart out. Then they burn the heart in a little fire. Torak isn't interested in the whole Thull, he only wants the heart. Relg flinched at that. They sacrifice women too, Silk pressed, but women have a simpler means of escape. The Grolums won't sacrifice a pregnant woman, it confuses their count, so Thullish women try to stay pregnant constantly. That explains why there are so many Thulls, and why Thullish women are notorious for their indiscriminate appetite. Monstrous! Relg gasped. Death would be better than such vile corruption. Death lasts for a long time, Relg, Silk said with a cold little smile. A little corruption can be forgotten rather quickly if you put your mind to it. That's particularly true if your life depends on it. Relg's face was troubled as he struggled with the blunt description of the horror of Thullish life. You're a wicked man, he accused Silk, though his voice lacked conviction. I know, Silk admitted. Relg appealed to Belgarath. Is what he says true? The sorcerer scratched thoughtfully at his beard. He doesn't seem to have left out very much, he replied. The word religion means different things to different people, Relg. It depends on the nature of one's god. You ought to try to get that sorted out in your mind. It might make some of the things you'll have to do a bit easier. I think we've just about exhausted the possibilities of this conversation, Father, Aunt Paul suggested, and we have a long way to go. Right, he agreed, getting to his feet. They rode down the arid jumble of rock and scrubby bushes that spread across the western frontier of the land of the Thulls. The continual wind that swept up across the escarpment was bitterly cold, though there were only a few patches of thin snow lying beneath the somber gray sky. Relg's eyes adjusted to the subdued light, and the clouds appeared to quiet the panic the open sky had caused him. But this was obviously a difficult time for him. The world here above ground was alien, and everything he encountered seemed to shatter his preconceptions. It was also a time of personal religious turmoil, and the crisis goaded him into peculiar fluctuations of speech and action. At one moment he would sanctimoniously denounce the sinful wickedness of others, his face set in a stern expression of righteousness, and in the next he would be writhing in agony of self-loathing, confessing his sin and guilt in an endless repetitious litany to any who would listen. His pale face and huge dark eyes framed by the hood of his leaf mail shirt contorted in the tumult of his emotions. Once again, the others, even patient, good-hearted Dernick, drew away from him, leaving him entirely to Garion. Relg stopped often for prayers and obscure little rituals that always seemed to involve a great deal of groveling in the dirt. It's going to take all year to get to Rakthal at this rate, Varric rumbled sourly on one such occasion, glaring with open dislike at the ranting fanatic kneeling in the sand beside the trail. We need him, Belgarath replied calmly, and he needs this. We can live with it if we have to. We're getting close to the northern edge of Thal Murgos, Silk said, pointing ahead at the low range of hills. We won't be able to stop like this once we cross the border. We'll have to ride as hard as we can to get to the south caravan route. The Murgos patrol extensively, and they disapprove of side trips. Once we get to the track, we'll be all right, but we don't want to be stopped before we get there. Will we not be questioned on the caravan route, Prince Keldar? Mandoralin asked. Our company is oddly assorted, and Murgos are suspicious. They'll watch us, Silk admitted. but they won't interfere as long as we don't stray from the track. The treaty between Tar Urgas and Ranbaroon guarantees freedom of travel along the caravan route, and no Murgo alive would be foolish enough to embarrass his king by violating it. Tar Urgas is very severe with people who embarrass him. They crossed into Thal Murgos shortly after noon on a cold, murky day, and immediately pushed out into a gallop. After a league or so, Relg began to pull in his horse. "Not now, Relg," Belgrath told him sharply. "Later." "But all's a patient god. He'll wait. Keep going." They galloped on across the high, barren plain toward the caravan route, their cloaks streaming behind them in the biting cold. It was mid-afternoon when they reached the track and reined in. The southern caravan route was not precisely a road, but centuries of travel had clearly marked its course. Silk looked around with satisfaction. "Made it," he said. "Now we become honest merchants again, and no Murgo in the world is going to interfere with us." He turned his horse eastward, then, and led the way with a great show of confidence. He squared his shoulders, seemed to puff himself up with a kind of self-importance, and Garya knew that he was making mental preparations involved in assuming a new role. When they encountered the well-guarded pack train of a Talnadran merchant moving west, Silk had made his transition, and he greeted the merchant with the easy camaraderie of a man of trade. "Good day, Grand High Merchant," he said to the Talnadran, noting the other marks of rank. "If you can spare a moment, I thought we might exchange information about the trail. You've come from the east, and I've just come over the route to the west of here. An exchange might prove mutually beneficial." "Excellent idea," the Talnadran agreed. The Grand High Merchant was a stocky man with a high forehead and wore a fur-lined cloak pulled tightly about him to ward off the icy wind. "My name is Ambar," Silk said, "from Kotu." The Talnadran nodded in polite acknowledgment. "Calvor," he introduced himself, "of Torhab. You've picked a hard season for journey east, Ambar." "Necessity," Silk said. "My funds are limited, and the cost of winter lodgings in Tal Honeth would have devoured what little I have." "The Honeths are rapacious," Calvar concurred. "Is Ranbaroon still alive?" "He was when I left." Calvar made a face. "And the squabble over the succession goes on?" Silk laughed. "Oh, yes." "Is that swine Kador from Tol Vordu still dominant? Kador fell upon hard times, I understand. I heard that he made an attempt on the life of Princess Sinedra. I imagine that the Emperor is going to take steps to remove him from the race." "What splendid news!" Calvor said, his face brightening. "How's the trail to the east?" Silk asked. "There's not much snow," Calvar told him. "Of course, there never is in Thal Murgos. It's a very dry kingdom. It's cold, though. It's bitter in the passes. What about the mountains in eastern Talnadra?" "It was snowing when we came through." "I was afraid of that," Calvar said with a gloomy look. "You probably should have waited until spring, Calvor. The worst part of the trip's still ahead of you." "I had to get out of Rakghaska." Calvor looked around almost as if expecting to see someone listening. "You're headed toward trouble, Ambar," he said seriously. "Oh?" "This is not the time to go to Rakghaska. The Murgos have gone insane there." "Insane?" Silk said with alarm. "There's no other explanation. They're arresting honest merchants on the flimsiest charges you ever heard of, and everyone from the west is followed constantly. It's certainly not the time to take a lady to that place." "My sister," Silk replied, glancing at Aunt Paul. "She's invested in my venture, but she doesn't trust me. She insisted on coming along to make sure I don't cheat her." "I'd stay out of Rakghaska," Calvor advised. "I'm committed now," Silk said helplessly. "I don't have any other choice, do I?" "I'll tell you quite honestly, Ambar. It's as much as a man's life is worth to go to Rakghaska just now. A Gerd merchant I know was actually accused of violating the women's corridors in a Murgo household." "Well, I suppose it happens sometimes. Murgo women are reputed to be very handsome." "Ambar," Calvor said with a pained expression, "the man was 73 years old." "His sons can be proud of his vitality, then," Silk laughed. "What happened to him?" "He was condemned and impaled." Calvor said with a shudder. The soldiers rounded us all up and made us watch. It was ghastly. Silk frowned. There's no chance that the charges were true? 73 years old, Ambar, Calvor repeated. The charges were obviously false. If I didn't know better, I'd guess that Tar Urgas is trying to drive all Western merchants out of Thal Murgos. Ratgaska simply isn't safe for us anymore. Silk grimaced. Who can ever say what Tar Urgas is thinking? He profits from every transaction in Ratgaska. He'd have to be insane to drive us out deliberately. I've met Tar Urgas, Silk said grimly. Sanity's not one of his major failings. He looked around with a kind of desperation on his face. Calvor, I've invested everything I own and everything I could borrow in this venture. If I turn back now, I'll be ruined. You could turn north after you get through the mountains, Calvor suggested. Cross the river into Mishrak Thul and go to Thul Mardu. Silk made a face. I hate dealing with Thuls. There's another possibility, the Tall Nadrid said. You know where the halfway point between Tal Haneth and Ratgaska is? Silk nodded. There's always been a Murgo resupply station there. Food, spare horses, other necessities. Anyway, since the troubles in Ratgaska, a few enterprising Murgos have come out there and are buying whole caravan loads, horses and all. Their prices aren't as attractive as the prices in Ratgaska, but it's a chance for some profit, and you don't have to put yourself in danger to make it. But that way you have no goods for the return journey, Silk objected. Half the profit's lost if you come back with nothing to sell in Tal Haneth. You'd have your life, Ambar, Calvar said pointedly. He looked around again nervously, as if expecting to be arrested. I'm not coming back to Thal Murgos, he declared in a firm voice. I'm as willing as any man to take risks for a good profit, but all the gold in the world isn't worth another trip to Ratgaska. How far is it to the halfway point? Silk asked, seemingly troubled. I've ridden for 3 days since I left there, Calvar replied. Good luck, Ambar, whatever you decide. He gathered up his reins. I want to put a few more leagues behind me before I stop for the night. There may be snow in the Tall Nadrin Mountains, but at least I'll be out of Thal Murgos and out from under the fist of Tar Urgas. He nodded briefly and moved off to the west at a fast trot, with his guards and his pack train following after him.